Welcome to Harvest Online. We're so thankful that you're here today. If you would do us a favor, click that subscribe button right down there, and we would love for you to follow along with us. You can get new content when it comes out. Also, hop on over to the socials, Facebook and Instagram, harvest.247. We'd love for you to like and follow those pages as well. And we exist so that all people may know Jesus and grow with Him. We are in the middle of a series on mental health, and we're calling it A Moment of Heresy. And the reason we're doing that is because a lot of times the church's response to people with mental health challenges has not always been that great. And a lot of times it's seen as being heretical if you struggle with those things. And what we are recognizing is that there's a significant portion of our communities in our nation and the world that are struggling with mental health. And we believe that the Bible has something to say about everything for all time. And so we believe that the Bible has something to say about mental health, and that if you were to read Scripture and read about various people in Scripture and what they went through and what they dealt with, it would be easy to see how they struggle with different things. Like last week we talked about Job and depression. We've talked about Paul and OCD. We've talked about Jesus and having to grapple with the temptations of all man, but still being God. And today we're going to talk about David. And David is a king, and David is someone who struggled with anxiety. And so the anxiety involves in persistent and excessive worry that interferes with daily activities. It's ongoing worry and tension that may be accompanied by physical symptoms such as restlessness, feeling on edge or feeling fatigued, difficulty concentrating, muscle tension, and problems sleeping or problems sleeping. And so have you ever been in that scenario where you've had anxiety? Or maybe a better way to ask it is, have you ever been between a rock and a hard place? I will share just a very brief story with you. I had never really had a problem sleeping until I became a pastor. And when I first became a pastor at the age of 33, I came face to face with the fact that I had trouble sleeping. And it's at that point that I started with Benadryl, started having to take Benadryl to fall asleep at night, and then melatonin to fall asleep at night. And the reason why is because of anxiety. And to some degree, I still struggle with that today. Usually take a melatonin to try to just ease some things to go to sleep. And here's why. I'm just going to give you some examples here, right? Constant criticism and second guessing was getting to me. Difficult conversations, being nitpicked, what I wear, what I don't wear, what I say, what I don't say. Difficult decisions that negatively affect people that I love, which is the cost of leadership. You make a decision that you have to make, but you know it's going to negatively affect people. Nobody likes to do that. The weight of the leadership, the weight of other people's expectations. And so all of those types of things, plus the weight of knowing what other people are struggling with. You know, I mean, people would tell me things that they're struggling with, and I'm like, man, I love these people, and I hate that they're going through these types of things. And so you wear that burden. And so when I became a pastor, that was one of those things that, like, I didn't anticipate, I didn't expect, and so I still struggle with it even today. And I think we've all felt some sort of anxiety before, right? I mean, maybe it's as small as, hey, before a big job interview, I'm a little nervous, or before we take a really big exam or test, or maybe it's during a difficult breakup. You know, you're feeling anxiety. Maybe after a poor diagnosis at the doctor, that they discovered something that you didn't know was there. Maybe it's losing a job, and I've been there before, and a lot of anxiety around, well, what's my identity, and how are we going to make ends meet? And what's the next step? And are we going to have to sell the house? And what are we going to do? You know, losing a marriage, or losing something, a relationship that's very important, important and meaningful to you. Or maybe it's being constantly abused by someone, or maybe it's just past ghosts that just keep coming up. I mean, all of these scenarios are difficult to deal with mentally and emotionally and spiritually. And they can create immense anxiety and prevent us from being able to carry out routine daily activities. Well, there's another person in Scripture that really has struggled with anxiety, and he's written about it extensively as well, and his name is David. And he's a king. And not only is he a king, but he's God's chosen king. And he was very resolute in the beginning. I mean, David, if you were to read, I got him right here. I'm just going to read some. God chose David to be king. He plays a harp for King Saul. He kills Goliath. Saul becomes jealous of David. David's marriage to Michal happens. David's had a great friendship with Jonathan. He meets and marries Abigail. David becomes king of Judah. Then he becomes king of Israel. David captures Jerusalem, and David brings the sacred chest to Jerusalem. I mean, these are some huge mountaintop moments to some degree in the life of David. But what we also understand when we read the story of David, kind of very similar to Job, David also had some tragedies, but the difference between Job and the difference between David is David made some really poor decisions in some of these things, which actually led to a lot of circumstances that mounted up and mounted up and mounted up that caused significant anxiety. Here's some examples. David had an affair with Bathsheba. And then he kills her husband. Absalom rebels against David. Absalom was his son, and he all of a sudden rebels against David. Absalom, his son, dies. And even though he raised up against him, David mourns. David begins to worry and starts counting people and has that whole thing going on. David gives instruction to his son Solomon, and David realizes he's not going to be able to build the temple that he always thought he was going to be. It's his son that's going to do it. And so he has experiences lost there. And then, of course, David dies. So you see in this life of David, these amazing mountaintop moments. He's the hero, but then he's also the villain. These tragedies that we just read about left David with a lot of anxiety. And in many cases, he had extreme anxiety. And today our passage in Psalm 57, 2-4, finds David in a time of extreme anxiety. He is being pursued by his enemies, and he is hiding in a cave. David finds himself in the wild being chased and is hiding in a cave of 20-foot vaults on the side of a cliff so that he is not to be found. So when we talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place, David is literally between a rock and a hard place. I mean, he is being pursued by Saul and his enemies. He's hiding out, and he has nowhere to go because the only thing that's outside of the cave he's hiding in is a cliff that he would fall to his death. I mean, he's definitely between a rock and a hard place. And here's the other thing: David is extremely anxious. And so here's what he writes in Psalm 57, 2-4. He says, "I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. He will send from heaven and save me. He will put to shame him who tramples me. Selah. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness. My soul is in the midst of lions, and I lie down among fiery beasts, the children of man, whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongue are sharp swords." So, let's take these verses in reverse. We'll start with Psalm 57:4. My soul is in the midst of lions. I lay down amidst fiery beasts, the children of man, whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. When we read this verse, what we see captured in this verse is David's mental anguish and struggles. And they are from pride, family issues, and bouts of depression. David had many reasons to believe his enemies were much more powerful than he did. He is describing his immense disadvantage. He's trying to appeal to the mercies of God, and he's trying to say, I am the absolute underdog. There is no way that I can get out of this scenario. I mean, think about what he's describing here metaphorically. I'm in the mouths of lions, fiery beasts. People's teeth are spears and arrows, and tongues are sharp swords. I mean, if we were in that type of scenario, in that circumstance, and some of us may be, and some of us have been, and some of us may will be again, those are those hopeless moments, those moments when we look around at all the circumstances, we look around at all the things that we see, and we're like, there is absolutely no hope for me. I'm not getting out of it. This scenario, this situation, this relationship, this loss of job is very personal, right? It's pervasive. It's going to affect every part of my life, and it's permanent. I'm never getting out of it. That's where David finds himself. Pastor Charles Spurgeon gave comfort, though, and advice to believers who felt they were among lions. And this is what he wrote. He said, if you're among lions, you will have fellowship with Jesus and his church. If you're among lions, you will be driven nearer to your God. If you're among lions, remember that God has them on a leash. And if you're among lions, remember there is another lion, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So David is in the midst of lions. It's almost like he's surrounded by them. There's no way out, between a rock and a hard place. And yet still, in the moment, he's appealing to the mercy of God. He's still believing that God can remove him from the situation, even though he's experiencing tremendous anxiety. Psalm 57:3, he writes, and he will send from heaven and save me. He will put to shame him who tramples me, Selah. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness. So David, in the midst of this scenario, declares that he knows what's true about God, that he will send from heaven and save him, and he will put to shame him who tramples him. David knows this. We often declare what we know mentally about God, but anxiety runs deep, and therefore must also believe in our heart what we declare about God. We can say all the right things when we're around the people. We can say all the right things when we're at church, but we've got to believe that God can deliver us deep down in our heart. And David is declaring something that is true of God, and that his love is steadfast and his love is faithful. That does not mean that his love is always quick. That does not mean that his love is always going to spare us. It just means that his love is steadfast. He's in it for the long haul, and he is faithful no matter what the circumstances are. And he writes Selah. Selah is pointing and declaring the assurance of the enemy's ruin. It is often symbolic of important transitions. Here it is placed, oddly, in the middle of a verse. Therefore, it is symbolic of an important transition in the thought and process of David and how he sees the circumstance. He says, Selah, and then the very next line he writes, God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness. In Psalm 57:2, he says this, I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. David came to a cave alone, and God was his only help. David was confident, knowing as a military man the strategic value of a high ground in battle. And he looked for help from the Most High, the one who occupied the greatest high ground of them all, which is heaven. So driven to a cave with a cliff on the side, between a rock and a hard place, David cries out to God with great faith, with great hope, that God is going to be who he says he is, and that he is going to be steadfast and he is going to be faithful. So, when we read this passage of Scripture, I think we can read it two ways. I think a lot of times we remember most what we read the last. And so when we read this passage of Scripture, Psalm 57:2-4, it reads like this, I cry out to God Most High, who fulfills his purpose for me. He will send from heaven and save me. He will put to shame him who tramples on me. Selah. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithful. My soul is in the midst of lions. I lie down amid fiery beasts, the children of man whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. And what we do is we read it and we're like, man, David's in a tough spot. But what if we read it in reverse? What would the end point be if we read it in reverse? What would be the assurance be that if we're in the midst of a lot of anxiety and we're wondering what's the future hold? What's the purpose for me in this life? Do I have a purpose? I just lost this job I was at. Do I have a purpose? I just lost this relationship. Do I have a purpose? I mean, I just lost, I can't get off this substance thing. Do I have a purpose? I'm so anxious about what's going on in the world today. I mean, is there even a purpose in living? I have so much hopelessness or whatnot. Well, I mean, what if we we read it in reverse, what would the end point be? What would the main point be? And this is how we would read it in reverse. My soul is in the midst of lions. I lie down amid fiery beasts, the children of man, whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. He will send from heaven and save me. He will put to shame him who tramples on me. Selah. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness. I cry out to God Most High. And here's the last line, and here's the last line for us, and here's the bottom line for us. To God who fulfills his purpose for me. God will fulfill his purpose for me. God will fulfill his purpose for you. You may not understand it. I may not understand it. It may be a bunch of trials. It may be a bunch of different circumstances. It may be very lonely. We're struggling with anxiety. We don't find our purpose. But here's the thing that we can understand that David knew. And David is a guy who had tremendous mountaintop moments and tremendous valley moments. And David is a guy that if there's anybody ever that understood this truth, it was David, because in the midst of in the mouths of lions, amidst fiery beasts, where people's teeth are like swords and spears, and their tongue and all is sharp and all of this kind of stuff. And when he was between a rock and a hard place, the place that David turned was the place that he knew he could turn, and that was to God. And his final thing, if we read it in reverse, is to God who fulfills his purpose for me. He knew that no matter what the circumstance looked like, no matter what he had done, no matter what it was, even when in the midst of anxiety, even struggling with it, he knew that God will fulfill his purpose for me. And that we don't always know what God's purpose is, but we know that he'll fulfill his purpose for us. And so that's one of those things that, like, if you're in the midst of anxiety and you're wondering what the future is going to hold, and you're struggling with your identity and you're struggling with purpose, there's one thing that we can know, and the only reason we can know it is because the guy that struggled with a lot of anxiety said it, that God will, you could say it in the mirror, God will fulfill his purpose for me. You can put it on a sticky note and put it in your car. God will fulfill his purpose for me. You can put it on your mirror. God will fulfill his purpose for me. You can put it on a computer. God will fulfill his purpose for me. I'm sure you could find it and make a screenshot and make a background on your phone or your iPad. God will fulfill his purpose for me. And it's a truth that we can continue to declare and continue to pray for and say, God, fulfill your purpose for me. I can't see it right now. I have a lot of anxiety right now. I don't know what the future holds right now, but God will fulfill his purpose for me. That's it. And that's what David declared in the midst of rock, hard places. So if you find yourself there with immense anxiety, I just want to give you one thing. Not because I said it, but because David said it. God will fulfill his purpose for you. And you will find his steadfast love and his faithfulness in that. God bless you.